Welcome back to the Atlantic Council. I'm Josh Lipsky, Chair of International Economics at the Council, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to one of our favorite events of the week, Decoding the World Economic Outlook. I believe this is our 11th or 12th edition of this event. It was one of the originals of IMF-World Bank Week at the Atlantic Council, taking the nitty-gritty of the WEO and unpacking it with experts, answering questions as well that we get online. So we'll try to get to as much as we can, and I'm joined by once again our fantastic senior fellows, Hung Tran, Senior Fellow at the Geoeconomics Center, former Deputy Director of Monetary and Capital Markets, Elizabeth Shortino, Senior Fellow at the Geoeconomics Center, former Executive Director, U.S. Executive Director at the IMF, Managing Director Alvarez and Marcel, Martin Mühleisen, former Director of SPR at the IMF and Senior Fellow at the Geoeconomics Center, and Nicole Goldin, Senior Fellow at the Geoeconomics Center, Head, Equitable Development, UNU, Center for Policy Research. Welcome back to the Council and welcome to Decoding the WEO. So here we go. Interesting WEO, small upgrades across the board. I'll see if I can put the main chart up. Here we go. This is from the fund. They're excellent graphics, which have improved over the years. All credit to them. And we see the US with a small upgrade, 0.1, UK, small upgrade, 0.1, Turkey, 0.5. We have the central bank governor of Turkey later this week, so we will ask him about that upgrade. And the world overall up 0.2 in 25 and flat in 26. Generally stable if you take out what's up and down in 26, but small upgrades for most economies in 25, which I think would be surprising to this group if we flash back to April when we had this event, and I asked everyone, myself included, if we thought there'd be upgrades and downgrades. Now, full context, this was 10 days after Liberation Day. There was a lot of volatility out there. But still, most of us, with the exception of Martin, thought there'd be a downgrade. So Martin, we'll ask you for all kinds of stock advice after this. But it's a surprising WEO, not in the moment for what it is, but if you step back over all the policy volatility of the last 8 or 9 months to see this stable, slightly optimistic WEO. But on the other hand, the tone of the WEO, I thought was pretty gloomy. And I was reminded, looking at the WEO blog and some of the language in there, I had a professor once, she handed back papers and she said, "Your essays were very good, sadly your grades don't reflect that." And I was just thinking of the WEO, this is a pretty good WEO from a data point, but some of the analysis around it, you could feel the undertone in it of concern, of uncertainty, and all of that just seemed to underlay it. So I want to go down the line, get your top line reactions, and then we're going to dive into a few of the data points, industrial policy, tariffs. But Hung, let me start with you.
Well, I would start to say that it turns out that in the curtain raiser speech by the managing director of the IMF last week, she already summarized much better than the WEO this time. She said, better than feared, but worse than what we need. And exactly, you can forget the whole report, and that is what you should take away with, number one. Number two, Josh mentioned about the upgrade and so on. We have to keep in mind that it is upgrade October 25 compared to the estimate in April 25, which were really pessimistic because no one at that point in time really knew what the tariffs will finally end up with. So now we have more clarity, at least compared to April 25. However, over the past 2 years from 2024, the IMF points out that global growth will still be 0.2% down by the end of 2026 compared with 2024. So upgrade, yes, but from a very, very pessimistic expectation. Number three, what I take away from the WEO this time is that excellent, like usual, analysis of what has happened, why the economy has been more resilient than we expected, ability of company to front load imports, to maneuver, to divert and change trade partners in order to continue to promote trade. So basically, also the very accommodative financial conditions, low interest rates still, and very buoyant equity markets. So excellent analysis. However, going forward, the proposed policies to deal with that is, at least to me, disappointing in the sense that they are, of course, correct logically to say that you need to have good policy, great. You have to reduce tariffs, great. You need to have cooperation to make the world less uncertain and more supporting of growth. Great, all of that is correct. However, we miss seeing any in-depth analysis of the factors, the conditions, the historical development over time that leads to the current situation of US protectionism on the one hand and Chinese mercantilism on the other hand, both of that squeezing many countries in between and really cause the whole outlook to be really not very good.
Thanks, Hung. And you mentioned China. I just have to flag for China, no change 25, no change 26. a safe non-revision on China. Elizabeth, over to you.
So Hung kind of said it all. You stole a lot of my thunder here, but that's good. No, I think a few things to add. I agree with you. There was some slight inconsistency in tone with the curtain raiser. You know, the MD made a pretty big point that the global economy is coping better than feared, but then again, global resilience has not been tested, whereas the WEO is titled Economic Prospects Dim, which I thought was a bit negative because we have a lot of competing forces right now in terms of negativity versus potential upside. So that was kind of one similar takeaway on my part. Uncertainty, uncertainty, uncertainty. I did a word search. It's mentioned over 100 times in the WEO alone. I wonder if maybe that's just the new reality and we need to start living with it as opposed to emphasizing that we have to eliminate it or reduce it. On another thing I thought was interesting was there was a decent job of acknowledging these competing forces on growth with the upside downside, but really surprising that there was almost no mention of cryptocurrencies, cross-border flows, new payment rails. I came from an event this afternoon at the IMF on the future of finance that was, I mean, the room was overflowing. Clearly, this is the area of interest. It's got huge opportunities, huge upside opportunities, and yet it really wasn't covered in the GFSR very much at all, not in the WEO. And then finally, I would agree with you that I thought the policy recommendations fell a little flat. And I think that's in part because there wasn't this acknowledgement of why are we seeing all of these tensions. So there was this point in one of the, on the trade side about, oh, you know, you should just reduce trade policy uncertainty and modernize trade rules. And a little bit of a throwaway to external rebalancing, but not really any recognition that this is a deeper rooted issue and the policy prescriptions need to go beyond those basic, you know, top lines.
Just to your point on trade, I'll pull up this chart that was in the WEO. This is effective tariff rates by country. And of course, you see some, you know, revisions since April, but look at where they are vis-a-vis N24. And no real prospect in the medium term that they get much lower than that, I think, for most countries. I mean, there's some exceptions, Brazil probably, but that's some of the disconnect I see from the relative change from January to now versus April to now and how we're pricing that in. Martin, over to you.
Yeah, I want to start with a disclaimer. Past forecast performance is not an indicator of future performance.
How did you do it?
Okay. Don't act on my advice. Okay, so this is a, how should I say? It's a very safe world economic outlook. It's what you would expect from the IMF, but yeah, I also share some of the things that were already said by Hung and Elizabeth about what's kind of missing to make this more interesting. Let's start with the projections without going into details, but it's in a way, it's taking into account that the tariff war has kind of almost settled, except for one big country. And so there's more certainty, and that means there's an upgrade compared to post-April. But because of the tariffs and other frictions, sure, the medium-term outlook is less than it used to be, say, a year ago. So, clear. It's interesting, and we should also mention it, that some countries, like in the Gulf, Nigeria, just looking at, they're really doing well. India is a big growth story. I mean, if you look at all the numbers, India is the one with the biggest growth rate. So, great. Talk more about it. Why? And what could they? What have they done that others could repeat? I also looked at the messages, whether they're kind of coherent. That's always been an issue, the GFSR, is it out of whack with the WEO? But I mean, this time around, I found it relatively complementary. By nature, the GFSR is a bit more kind of risky, pessimistic, because they don't want to be seen missing on something, whereas the WEO is a bit more driven by maintaining good relations with shareholders, so we're not being too pessimistic on the numbers. So, but that's baked into these kind of exercises. But I mean, they've been consistent, which is great. In terms of the risks, I don't know whether you had a chance to read these articles, but The Economist had a special feature on public debt, especially in advanced economies. Talk about gloomy. They having a debt crisis on the horizon for advanced economies. They don't specify when, but I mean, we're going toward that. Very, very pessimistic. The FT, Chris Childs, had a piece that was very good, I thought, where he said, well, you guys are far too gloomy because you're looking at the advanced economies and you're not seeing that the emerging market and developing countries that make up an even bigger share, increasingly, of the world economy, if you don't look at the exchange rate per se, if you look at PPP, they're actually doing not too badly. They've been quite resilient. So I think they're somewhere in the middle, and I wouldn't kind of complain too much about it. Now, when it comes to policy recommendations, we've had this discussion before. I'm sure that my former colleagues at the fund would start out by saying, well, we'd love to basically tell the US and China to get their act together on the trade war. Even if we acknowledge that we can't have the political commitment, or that they will kind of be rivals for the foreseeable future, at least what they could do for the rest of the world is that the US should rethink its bilateral tariffs on smaller countries where, yes, maybe they have a big trade deficit, but it's peanuts in terms of the overall amount. Why burden these countries with high tariffs? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's an arithmetic exercise that they should undo as quickly as possible. At the same time, China needs to be reminded time and again that it's great that you're kind of trying to work with the global south and trade and investment, but do it at terms that are beneficial for them and for you, and don't look always at your own interest, because that's a big issue when it comes to debt and trade deals and all the like. Don't just make money out of these countries, help them grow and develop, make investments that are maybe not politically driven by the ruling class, but that really benefit the country. I don't think they're doing that to the extent they could. That's something that I would like to see in the WEO for the benefit of that country, those countries. Then the curtain raiser had something about exchange rates. Great, finally, China is depreciating. Why? They have a huge current account surplus. It's increasing. So put your finger right there. Why is there no, or the staff, I'm sure, would love to say, well, China should actually have a sensible exchange rate policy and not one going in the wrong direction. And of course, in Europe, it should have been much stronger on Europe itself. Now, why aren't they? Well, first of all, the WEO is, after all, a board document. It has to go through the board. And they have to approve it, and that would be very hard, I think, with some of these statements in there. But I want to defend staff here that I'm sure they thought about it, but it just can't show up in the final product, which is too bad. But I think also managements of both institutions, but especially at the IMF right now, have been very careful not to, I think, raise the stakes too much in terms of relations with the big shareholders. So it's just a fact. I wish it had been done, but we have to live with the WEO as it is.
Thanks, Martin. And Nicole, I want to turn to you on the debt issue, but on the emerging markets and low-income countries. Usually we talk about that in that context. Now we're talking about it in the advanced economy context. Yeah. But what did you see from the WEO on EMs and LICs?
Yeah, and so thanks. It's great to be here with everyone, and I always feel like I need to remind people, and everyone has their IMF titles, and I think I get my seat from my former role at the World Bank, and so I read the WEO and sort of come to this conversation with that particular interest, not only because, as Martin said, they're sort of accounting for an increasing share of the global economy, but let's remember the larger share of the global population and the people sort of behind the numbers. And while, so agree with all the takes on the curtain raiser versus the outlook itself. I thought the curtain raiser was, I remember watching and thinking, oh, this feels a little rosy. And then, sort of a more muted shade of mauve, so to speak, when we got the report today. And yes, there were upgrades, but to your point about the EMDEs, that is actually where we see some downgrades. And the lower income countries in particular had some fairly significant downgrades, even compared to the mix, even compared to the middle income countries. There were some notables, as you mentioned, Nigeria and India, but generally, we see the downgrades, and a lot of it is debt, but not only in the EMDEs itself. I mean, I also did a word search, uncertainty, debt, 48 times just in chapter 1. I'll have to go back and do a full-scale search, but notable. And we've been talking about debt. But it's interesting because it also they did talk about some of the why, and it speaks to this geopolitical, the fragmentation that we've been talking about more broadly, and some of the things we flagged yesterday in the preview event, which is, in particular, if you want to talk about sub-Saharan Africa, but again, a lot of these developing countries, we're seeing the cuts in ODA and in bilateral assistance and multilateral. We are seeing the trade and the tariffs have disproportionate incomes on many of these economies. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have to talk about the expiration of AGOA last month and the expectation of what the impact that will have on many of the African economies. So, in many ways, I feel like the WEO and what's happening in the EMDEs and the downside risks that they're reflecting are kind of a microcosm of the broader conversation that we're having and some of the key issues that we're talking about this week, trade and debt, certainly.
Can I add something to the low-income country?
Please do.
Yes, two statistics that really struck my attention is number one, 3.4 billion people now live in countries whose debt service is greater than spending for education or healthcare, number one. Yep. And number two, for all low-income countries, the net official development assistance, net ODA, now is smaller than their debt service.
Yes.
Back in the year 2000, net ODA is 5 percentage points of GDP greater than debt services. So in many ways, those low-income countries really suffer a lot after COVID, and now with the tariffs conflict, we really should pay more attention to them.
Yeah, external debt payments overall, just in the 2023, which was the last data point, was 1.4 trillion.
Yeah.
I mean, it is extraordinary, and yet we actually talked about the 3.4 billion number this morning.
And in fact, those countries now pay more to the rest of the world in terms of creditors and ODA than they receive from the rest of the world. So basically, even though they are in difficult situation, they have a negative cash flow.
Yeah. So Elizabeth, can I turn to you on this question that I've thought about coming into the meetings and then reading the WEO, which is, you look at a chart like this, US effective tariff rate. I'll pull up this next chart, which is industrial policies across AEs. This is over the last 15 years or so. The IMF launched an analytical chapter with us the week before the meetings. Yep. But when you step back and think about it, the global economy is being reshaped, at least from the perspective of the world's largest economy, and mirroring industrial policies across advanced economies, high debt across advanced economies. I mean, these are tectonic shifts, but they're not impacting global growth. And so it just brings a question to mind: is the things we thought were drivers of global growth not as much? Is it all an AI story? But there's some reconciliation here that I'm struggling with, and I'm curious for your opinion.
Yeah, and I don't have the right answer, but I think it's a great point, and it gets to this curtain raiser message where I think the IMF expected to have a lot more negative news, and they don't. And so they're trying to sound the warning, but the economy still remains resilient. I mean, I think that speaks to just trade flows still continue, and yes, there are restrictions, but they're also, it's like water going through. It's going to go, and some of these things are going to find their way around. And also just financial markets. I mean, so dominate. The government policies are important, but the importance of financial markets is even more so. And as long as those remain stable and flowing, and you are able to finance investment, and that investment can go into different countries, I think that speaks to some of the resilience. I also do agree with the managing director that you're coming from a better policy base. So, look at 20 years ago, a lot of these countries didn't have flexible exchange rates. Many of them do, and the ones that don't are the ones that are getting in trouble, right? Or the ones that have maybe more, overvalued exchange rates and continue to defend them. And they're the ones that have to go to the IMF. And I think we have all kind of think of a few names in there.
Unconnected to that, we're going to have Argentina's finance central bank governor here.
Yeah.
Totally unrelated to your comment.
So it is, but it's an interesting point that we really need to, as we're remaking this rules-based order, and the WIO even acknowledges that the rules-based order is being remade, we also need to step back and question what is driving growth and what isn't, and really better understand that. So, and I think that would be an excellent analytical piece for the IMF or maybe another institution to do, maybe the Atlantic Council at some point, because it's the right question.
I was struck by that in the curtain raiser. Kristalina talked about tariffs, talked about protectionism, and then went straight to AI CapEx investment. And the connection there is clear, but there's more to be said about the two and the risk inherent. Martin, do you want to comment?
Yeah, they could have said a bit more about the drivers, as Elizabeth said. I mean, let's first acknowledge that there is a lot of fiscal money out there, right? In Europe, it's mentioned, for example, in Germany, that they're spending, but everywhere that is growing up, is growing. In the US, the fiscal impulse, so the change in the fiscal stance is not that big. It may even be slightly negative, but the overall fiscal position is hugely expansionary, right? Because of the deficit, the run-up in debt. That means long-term interest rates going up. At the same time, people may be looking for more safety in the stock market, which does better under inflationary conditions, as many may expect, which in turn happens to coincide with the AI investment, and everybody's going after that. So there's some kind of dynamics here that may unwind quite rapidly, and I mean implicitly they acknowledge that because of, for example, looking at the financial sector vulnerabilities and the like. It's not explicit there, but I think it's good that they're downgrading still the outlook for 26, and I'm a bit more pessimistic for the years after when all these issues come home to roost, including, especially on inflation, for example, in the US. I think there's quite a bit in the pipeline. We just haven't seen it yet.
Can I get back to the disconnect?
Let me get to Nicole and then Hung.
I meant to pick up quickly on something, Elizabeth, I was glad you brought up I wasn't there, but I watched that same conversation on the future of finance, and it was really fascinating. And I was also struck in the conversation about AI that is in the WIO, that they did not bring up, again, that interoperability and that other piece that did come up in the future finance conversation. But in the AI discussion, again, kind of going back to where some of the risks, I thought it was did not necessarily, again, point out some of the inequality risks. And in looking to some of the, again, potential upside of AI, I think that is there in some of the EMDEs, but we have to remember, again, that the gap in terms of, where the compute centers are, where the investments are being made, that is, I think we need to sort of just keep that in mind a little bit more.
I also didn't do, Jeremy Mark always does this, I didn't do a climate control F search, but I think we would not find many references if we did.
We would not find many references if we did, which is something that I mentioned we talked about this morning, and it's worth mentioning the same 3.4-ish billion number of people living in countries where they spend more on debt service and health and education is actually the same number of people, roughly. It's actually the midpoint of the range of people living in in climate vulnerable countries, where the impacts of extreme heat, floods, droughts, and again the adverse potential economic devastation that's associated with it. So it's just an interesting point.
Hung.
Keep in mind.
Yeah, back to the question of the disconnect between technological advances and AI-related, hardware, software, data centers purchases, and the stagnant growth outlook. And the key thing, which I think not analyzed by the WIO, but has done analyzed very well by the OECD, is the lack of diffusion of best practices and technological advances. So the AI and so on has improved productivity and profit for the key companies or conglomerates that really invest a lot, the Magnificent Seven in the US, and they really enjoy huge profit over the past decade and a strong productivity. But the rest of the economy has been left behind in terms of adopting these best practices, and the divergence is wider. So on average, stagnant, but clear, big winner, and a lot of really laggards and left behind. And that go back to Nicole's point about the inequality between the top earners, the top winners, and many, many people who really feel left behind, which get back to the tariffs and so on, is one of the important factor behind the tariffs and protectionism that the US feels that it needs to do to rectify this problem.
The other interesting thing, kind of picking up on this AI and the data centers, there's nothing that I saw in the WIO about the potential constraints there. And that, I mean, you look at what is the US doing? We are running around trying to invest in critical minerals and secure deals. And other countries, frankly, are kind of doing the same. And that's because that's going to be the constraining factor, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's energy production, on all of these advances. Yet that's not even viewed as it's not even included as a risk. I thought that was rather surprising.
One thing, Elizabeth, let me ask you, and then I'll come, Martin, Nicole, to you, that was raised as a risk was erosion of trust and credibility at institutions.
Yes.
So that was interesting. Not always a part of WIOs.
Right.
Take us inside. I like to do this at the decoding process. You've been at the board, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Obviously not in this WIO, but when something sensitive like that comes up, everyone sort of knows what you're talking about, but wants to be diplomatic about it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting inclusion in the WIO.
I thought it was interesting too. I mean, certainly the IMF has talked about central bank independence in past WIOs, but I think I did a word search on this one as well, and it was something more than 30 times. And it ranged from central bank independence to technocratic institutions being allowed to focus on their core mandates. So it actually kind of started to get at some other
It's a little self-interested in the IMF.
in the United States. So it was very,
I welcome that.
but there was no country called out by name. So I did find that interesting and a bit unusual that they hit that over the head. I think the IMF feels very strongly about it, and rightfully so. So it's probably good they mentioned it a lot, but it was different.
Please.
Just in response, the fund used to have, it's been a while, they used to have country-specific paragraphs or even sections in the WIO. I think there was a chapter 2 that went over the country stuff. That was at some point dropped because I think it just raised the time for discussion and review endlessly because of the country-specific stuff. But still, I mean, what you want from these institutions right now is in a way strong leadership while taking into account these political constraints. And I don't see that. You don't have to talk about climate. You can talk about natural disasters. You can talk about energy
Extreme
needs.
weather,
right?
exactly.
Extreme weather and all that. Absolutely. The fund used to talk about inequality, which is in many ways, the need for social spending and the like is a key issue. Now it's been very sanitized, so to speak, just to be politically correct, and that on both institutions by a drive to be the leader on that new analysis that took all that into account, and overnight it's been gone. I understand the politics, but I would have wished that they would have stuck a bit more to their guns, quite frankly.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to get to Q&A. So please, anyone watching online, use askac.org. Anyone here, please raise your hands, and we will get to you. I want to ask the China question, whoever wants to take it. It's always a fun one, which is we have no revisions to China. So we have 4.8 in 25, 4.2 in 26. Now, Secretary Bessent has said China's trying to avoid a depression. So who's right, the IMF or the Treasury Department? And how much is this going to come to a head with the new first deputy managing director? We have Dan Katz now in, obviously not involved in this process, but going forward will be. So Hung, let me turn to you.
Right, two things. How you assess China's current performance and future prospects depends on which kind of numbers you look at. If you look at official numbers by the Chinese government and IMF World Bank data, then basically you see stable, lower level of equilibrium. So instead of 6 to 10% 10 years ago, it's about 4 to 5% each going forward. And there's good argument to say why it should be that case because of fiscal support and monetary easing and so on and so forth. However, if you look at the alternative set of numbers that different organizations try to come up with, looking at using of electricity, light from satellite, and so on and so forth, then China is really down in the doldrums. Which set of numbers is correct? Basically, I tend to look at the history and the consistency over time. And if you look at it that way, and particularly you look at the trade performance of China, they must be doing something right to be able to produce, export, and by this year they will accumulate $1.2 trillion of trade surplus. That means their goods, the goods that they make are desirable. People bought them, and therefore they can grow. So if you look at that, I tend to go with the kind of stable as you go situation, 4.8, but let's say between 4 and 5%. Now, IMF and China, the background is that in July, Treasury Department report to Congress its involvement and engagement with IMF World Bank. And it clearly says that it wants these institutions to focus to their core mission, and more than that, to align more with US policy priorities and agenda. And among the policy agenda is to marginalize and limit the influence of malign actors, which is really, i.e., China. Now, the FDMD used to be the chief of staff for Secretary Bessent. His job at the IMF is really one of an international civil servant. He is not supposed to bring national perspective in discharging his function. He has to look at the whole multilateral organization. But on the other hand, he's very closely connected with the administration. So how he will navigate this will be very fascinating to watch.
I agree. I'd be very curious to see any change in tone, not change in data, because we know how the IMF respects that in terms of the analysis, but some of the tonal issues around China going forward would be interesting. Martin.
I forgot to mention earlier when I said the fiscal position of the advanced economies, China is also run by subsidies, right, at the moment. I mean, all these industrial subsidies that foster that technological progress and that lead to real big problems in the manufacturing sectors elsewhere is there. They've been treading very carefully on China, but there's been a discussion paper that came out recently on industrial policy in China and the costs of it, which I thought was a very good step. So more of that, please, and a bit more elevated would be great. But I also feel reminded of the episode in 2007 and later when the US under the second Bush administration also went after the IMF of not being outspoken enough on the current account imbalances. And the fund came up with a way of determining whether countries run an imbalanced and manipulated exchange rate system. And that was clearly aimed at China, which then quickly said that they're not going to be interested in Article 4 consultations anymore, or at least in the publication thereof. And that lasted 2 or 3 years until the global financial crisis. And I think the only country in the end that was nabbed was a very small island in the Indian Ocean for gross misalignment of its exchange rate. But such is multilateralism sometimes. But my point, I think, my point is that China has played along at the IMF. They try to utilize the multilateral institutions for their own political purposes. But sometimes by necessity, the fund is a bit careful in how far it goes. That's really a question for the next couple of months, how the US administration and IMF management and the broader membership approach the China issue. I don't see it beyond China to say, well, sorry guys, but if you're not playing by the established rules anymore, if you're really going after us, we stay members, but we don't need to engage with you, right? Apparently there's already some talk, which I heard behind the scenes, that maybe they're kind of moving to 2 or 3 year Article 4 consultation cycles. It may not be correct, but I've heard the rumor. I think it would be a gross mistake
2 or 3 years,
to lose contact with your country officials that benefit you on a regular basis.
As a general, China specific? Or
No,
just
no, I mean in general. But if China withdraws from the Article 4 process, which they can't be prevented from, it would be losing one more way of looking into the Chinese economy. So I understand that they need to treat carefully, but there's a limit to it in kind of letting China get away with policies that are grossly distorting and not being outspoken enough, I think.
Nicole, I want to just come back to you on this inequality point that you raised. I mean, there's been past WEOs, I remember, where there was a lot of focus on employment across a range of economies, not as much in this WEO. And I'm thinking divergence of the bank's messaging, jobs, 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 cannot walk in and out of the bank without seeing that, versus the funds messaging, which is not always typical of the WEO, but I just noticed that in this.
Yeah, I'm glad you flagged that. I feel like, when I've been in these WEO conversations, I'm always the one that's there sort of saying, hey, I know it's not really about, it's not what the WEO is about. But another kind of interesting from the curtain raiser to what's in the WEO, the MD talked a lot about demographics.
Yeah.
And especially in the context of young people and the jobs. And again, I think the quick word search of just chapter 1, I think jobs is mentioned 4 times.
Yeah.
So it is, again, somewhat surprisingly absent. But what I did think was interesting was getting into chapter 3 a little bit. I think it does come up a little bit more in the discussion around industrial policies, and in fact that you actually need the structural policies and the investments in the education. And in some of the other things in order to sort of have the growth, and that can actually have more impact potentially than the industrial policy. So it was a little bit surprising of all WEOs not to maybe see a little bit more of a focus on the inequality between, but also I think within countries. But to say it's a little bit par for the course maybe is.
No, I was just thinking about what you were saying on the industrial policies. Christine Lagarde gave the fix the roof speech, fix the roof while the sun is shining, and now it's, in my mind, fix the roof while you're building a steel fortress around the house, which is not difficult to do because the steel fortress is hard to build.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah.
I was just going to say on the China point, it'll be interesting to see what the upcoming U.S. Article 4 says.
Yes,
so as
right.
you know, the U.S. and China delayed their Article 4 reviews until after the annual meetings. Actually, I think they're kicking off probably right around now. And so we shall see. The last China Article 4 that was done was far more hard-hitting, I thought, than they have previously been. We have a new FDMD in place. Maybe this one will be even more hard-hitting. I don't know. I hope the U.S. Article 4 is pretty hard-hitting. I hope that it calls the U.S. to task on the fiscal side in particular. We want to resolve imbalances. That's a key way to do it. So we shall see.
Can I pick up really quickly on the trust
30 seconds,
point? Sorry, 30 seconds. Just because I just want to. It's interesting contextual to see it in the WEO, in this WEO, and following from sort of. We're only a couple weeks after the UN General Assembly and UN 80. I know we sometimes forget that actually the Bretton Woods institutions are part of the broader multilateral system. And just to note that the whole idea of sort of trust and multilateralism and international cooperation is again a big part of the conversation there, but also this week, especially as it relates to dwindling development cooperation and development assistance and all the things we need in order to kind of muster the way forward.
That's right, and I'm glad you raised that, and we talked about it yesterday in the preview event, and we need to keep that theme going throughout our work, at least at the Council, even if it's not as much part of the formal meetings. All right, we're going to end the way we always end with the prediction. Martin, you're going last because we can't just draft off you this time. So, you know the question, upgrade, downgrade, or no revision. when we do this in April? Hung, I'm going to start
Global.
with you.
Global. Okay.
Just
I would say
keep it simple.
downgrade because the lack
Downgrade? Just wanna
of
make sure we got it
tariffs
right.
and the AI boom probably will slow down. Not collapse, but slow down. Both will cause kind of my case of stagflation.
Yeah. Elizabeth?
I'm going to say no revision
Flat.
because I think there's, to be safe.
Yeah.
I think the fund will want to be safe, and I think, yeah, so no revision.
Nicole, Martin will come back to you.
I am going to go with. I'd like to be optimistic, but I just don't think I can. So I'm gonna go with a no revision. I feel like
I'll go downgrade. I'll align with Hung. I think some of the CapEx hype peters out a bit over the next 6 months. Martin?
Well, I follow my strategy from last time of being the outlier. So
You just keep, you're like the stock market.
until one of you guys goes first.
All right, so we have more of a split decision from the group, which I think is fun. It'll make for a great reunion when we come back together in April. Hung, Elizabeth, Martin, Nicole, thank you again. And thank you for all you do for the center and for the council in the midst of a busy week and so many responsibilities. We really deeply appreciate your expertise in helping us navigate this important moment for the global economy. Thank you to everyone for joining us at the Atlantic Council today for day 2 of IMF World Bank Week. Tomorrow we kick off day 3. We have Spain's finance minister, we have Argentina's finance minister and central bank governor. We have a series of analytical events at the IMF and special events here at the council and from our Content Creation Center inside the World Bank. So come find us, come say hi. We wish everyone a successful week and a pleasant rest of the day.